Alonso, me vas a tener que aguantar este móvil, bueno, ser responsable de que el móvil grabe, ¿vale? Bueno, puedes dejarlo si quieres, si te voy a, pero que se grabe, ¿vale?
Que habla, ¿no?
Sí, que se vea ese, ¿vale?
Rato.
Sí, o sea que si quieres pues poner algo para que se apoye y tal, ¿vale? Pero que vigiles que no se le salte una alarma a la mano, que no se ve. Parece casi.
Pero la puta la valla. Ah, lo saluda. 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 Se venía casi cerrado, dice que está en cuerpo.
Vale, una cosa importante. Recordad, vale, que en este debate vamos a ser más flexibles en el sentido de que si tú eres refutador, el otro equipo te pregunta algo y a lo mejor no te cojo, necesitas ayuda de tu equipo, tienes permiso para acercarte a tu equipo, ¿vale? Permiso para acercarte, pues si no has entendido la pregunta, también si no has entendido lo que dice el otro equipo, de aquí casi un permiso, ¿vale? Yo paro el tiempo, ¿vale? O sea que eso no hay problema. Voy a cerrar la ventana para oír bien.
Vamos a la mesa. Vamos a la mesa. Ahora mismo está vivo.
Bueno, venga, pues va saliendo. No estoy bajando.
Si leo un poquito de más cosa o algo.
Hombre, me da feo. Pero a ver, si necesitas leer, pues lee.
Yo no voy a leer.
Mejor.
Te prometo que
Yo
no
voy
leo.
a valorar, es que no voy a ¿Qué vas a leer?
El que has dicho, si leemos.
Hombre, a ver, si una evidencia tanto que no estoy leyendo y todo eso que te lo
Yo no voy a leer.
Vale. Bueno, pues nos callamos. Cuando empecéis vosotros a hablar, le doy.
Vale. Friedrich Hayek, an economist, jurist, and Greek philosopher, said, "Freedom does not only mean that the individual has the opportunity of their way and choice. It also means that he must bear the consequences of his actions. Freedom and responsibility are inseparable. Because freedom and responsibility are two parallel and inseparable concepts, and that is why it has been said that the statue of liberty needs the statue of responsibility to form a perfect couple." Good morning, Luna, opposing team, jury, and audience. My name is Miguel Navarro, and my team is made up by Pablo Seve, Natalia, and Claudia Gomez. The question we are discussing today is, does freedom and responsibility go hand by hand? And we position ourselves in favor of the question. But before we begin to explain this, we must define some terms. Responsibility, being able of being aware of your obligations and act in accordance with them, and also becoming guilty of your acts. Freedom, natural faculty that a person has to act in one way or another, and circumstances, conditions, or characteristics of time, place, which involves a person and interest in them. Once the terms are defined, I'm going to pose the questions. So we can see what the question says. Those natural faculty that a person has to act in one way or another, and being aware of your obligation go hand by hand. To understand this, I'm going to put an example. When our parents established a timetable for us in the afternoons, based on studying and then playing as a reward, that was like an obligation, and we didn't have any liberty and responsibility because we were too young to understand it. This changed when we decided not to do our homework because we are choosing someone, and that means that we have freedom. Finally, I would like to summarize our arguments. Freedom and responsibility are two pillars of the society, in which we're going to explain the importance of these terms in us as a society relying on ethics and law. 2. Freedom and responsibility is different society. In this argument, we will see cases in which responsibility is not given to certain people, and therefore freedom is not given. And 3. Freedom and circumstances. We will see deeper examples of the mythical phrase, I am myself and my conditions, by Ortega and Gasset. And finally, I would like to repeat our thesis, which says, being free within your circumstances, you have your responsibility for what you do within the freedom that they bring.
People are not always sure about which thing predominate when making decisions, and they are responsible for why or what we do something for. And many times we believe that we make a decision based on intuition, but usually we have evaluated some elements that lead you to a certain situation. Good morning, una Stefania Public, I'm Rebecca, I'm partner at the Frida Paula Hall. Therefore, we're faced with the question that arises that is freedom and responsibility go hand in hand. Our three arguments are put forward that show that it is not true. They do not go hand in hand based on the thesis which say that. We consider that freedom does not go hand in hand with responsibility signed in great code and in hand in hand with the decision that we make consciously, and this may or may not be made freely. But before moving forward with the arguments, it is important to contextualize the question in question. What do we mean by freedom? Freedom is the right of a people to responsibly choose the way of acting within society. Another crucial concept for this topic is responsibility. Being responsible means fulfilling all our obligations, as well as making the right decision and being able to act well for ourselves. And to finish the contextualization, we will take about determinism, which is the theory to affirm that phenomena are determined for some reason. Through the entire debate we take it with a bit about it. In the fifth place, we will think about all the decisions we make in one day. How through or least we make millions of decisions, most of which we are not aware of. So science they are decisions that we make consciously. They have no consequence, therefore they do not apply to use of responsibility. All this leads you to the next argument. The responsibility for our decision falls on everyone. We say that although on many occasions we are free, the responsibility for the decision you make for others. And the third and last argument, determinism also leads to responsibility. The fact that we are so far responsibility in cases in which we are determined that we are not free. And that is why our last argument states that it is not that responsibility is limited to freedom.
Eka, can you repeat the thesis? Si no s'ha entendido.
We consider that freedom does not go hand in hand with responsibility, since it will go hand in hand with the decision that we make consciously, and this may or may not be made freely.
Ok, ahora oye, si nos lo dan todo, es que. Ok, la leo ahora.
Freedom goes with the decisions we make consciously, and this may or may not be made freely.
Salga de duda. Sí. Yo lo dije, eso lo
Oye,
digo.
señor, en inglés no era argumento otros institutos. No, ellos no. Ah,
Tú, ¿sabes Juan?
chico,
¿Cuántos
hombre, bueno,
productos son
vamos a seguir
esto de la
una
película
mejor cuando
de
terminemos
un dos,
el debate.
paso de la cual. Sí. Al final otros minutos incluso ahí.
Hello, contrary team, public assistant and jury. My name is Claudia and I'm the number one. The first argument is freedom and responsibility are the two pillars of society. Freedom is a concept that is closely related to ethics. But what do we understand by ethics? This is a necessary philosophical discipline that we use to consider what is right and what is wrong, and what is allowed or not, especially focused on our society. Thanks to ethics, we set some limits that we can live, so that we can live properly in a functional society. These ethical limits are included in the legislation of a country, which restricts our freedoms to be able to live in a society as citizens. If we, as citizens, and with freedom in one hand, decide to disobey or violate any of these laws because we can, we are punished by the particular government of our society, because we are responsible for our actions. Freedom and responsibility go hand by hand. When freedom threatens society, for example, killing someone, society imposes a consequence of evil. Again, the restrictions of a society may vary depending on the particular society in which we live. We see that, for example, in the case of committing homicide. In Spain, the Article 158 of the Penal Code establishes that el que mandare a otro será castigado como de homicidio con la pena de prisión de 10 a 15 años. But on the other hand, in Colombia, the Article 158 of the Penal Code establishes that el que mandare a otro como de homicidio incluirá prisión de 13 a 25 años. With this, we want to show that our freedom as human beings has to be limited so we can live in a society. Therefore, as ordinary citizens, we have common responsibilities. When we put our freedom above that of the rest, we assume a consequence that is also greater than that of the rest. The second argument is called when freedom and responsibility escape from society. There are two exceptions where freedom can be treated differently. The children have not yet learned enough to do so, or are unable to learn. For instance, a child accidentally knocks over a vase. He has not yet learned how to act or not to prevent this. He does not have sufficient knowledge to really make that decision about his actions.
But how can you prove that
idea of will make it. Therefore, he cannot be as responsible or assume the same consequences as another, who already knows how to behave. For that, we assume that when you are a child, you are neither free or irresponsible. Since when you begin to be free, that is aware of your decisions. It indicates that you have reached a certain mental maturity to be also responsible. We corroborate this with a more extreme case in which a kid committed a crime, according to the third article of the Organic Law 5 of 2000. Cuando el autor de los hechos mencionados en los artículos anteriores sea menor de 14 años, no se exigirá responsabilidad con arreglo a la presente ley. This last example helps us to talk about the second case. The people that aside from society carry the full responsibility of them because it belongs to their freedoms. These kinds of people continue to be governed by the laws of the country in which they are located. But in the hypothetical case that we will lose contact with society and itself penalizes you for your actions because it is unaware of them. Those people will be seen as responsible. If a person kills someone being exiled from society, that means that he assumes great freedom. Therefore, he assumes a great responsibility, although its consequences are different from those proposed in a society. The consequences of taking that freedom in a society would be getting in jail. And next year, it would be your conscience, for example. Thank you.
Primero, esa es la etiqueta. Que además la etiqueta es el banco. Deja la camiseta por.
Los artículos de ya todo en español o en inglés. Good morning, I'm Paula and I'm the first refuter of my team. As Rebecca has commented, we will defend the decision against with our three arguments. Before I start, I would like to mention a couple of things that the opposite team has commented. You say that freedom and responsibility are always linked, but Lucia, after we explain that there are some cases in which there are responsibility but not freedom. Now I will start with my first argument. All the decisions that we make in one day. First, we are aware of less than 1% of the decisions we make. Through a single day, we make an average of 35,000 decisions, of which 99.74% are made automatically by our brain. And that is, we are only aware of less than 1% of all the decisions that we make for a single day. Data from the Europa Press and News Agency. We shows who freedom understand as free will, that Rebecca has commented, does not always entail responsibility because these decisions that we make unconsciously are so insignificant that they have no consequence. So they do not imply the use of responsibility. And secondly, for constitute decisions, the humanity entails the use of responsibility.
Don't you think that the 99% of the decisions that we make are something that is in general, like breathing, eating, is something normal, but the important decisions imply responsibility or not?
Yes, but as we all explained, these decisions are the minority, so we can affirm that responsibility go hand by hand with freedom. Well, what's more, not only are we aware of very few of the decisions we make in a day, but responsibility for all of this is not necessary. An example of this will be when we choose the clothes to wear to class one day, or when we have to think about what to eat one day. We are aware that we are making a decision, therefore we are free to choose, but since it is a decision without any consequences, we do not imply responsibility. We make too many decisions, of which few are important. Therefore, of all the decisions we make in our life, there are a minority in which we apply responsibility. So, Does freedom carry responsibility, or are only certain decisions that require it? My second argument talk about how even being free, the responsibility for our decisions falls on them. Having seen the previous argument in which we explained that vast majority of decisions do not carry responsibility because they have no consequences, in this argument we will show how we can never make a decision without direct influence, and how in these cases where we are apparently being free, the final decision is ours, we are not actually responsible for our choice. Research carried out by scientists from the University of Bath, United Kingdom, among other centers, suggests that the environment we inhabit or through which we move and socialize influence our decision, because our mental progress are linked to movement and perception. So, taking into account our previous arguments, and I can affirm that it is impossible to affirm that freedom and responsibility always go hand by hand. Thank you.
Hola, desayunado. Paula. Paula. Paula, ¿has desayunado? ¿Has desayunado? No, no decía.
The contradiction doesn't pronounce. Está puntuation.
Natalia, in your hand, if you want, you can ask the tesis again.
Thank you.
Because it's your time.
Se pilla la tesis ya, Pablo. Tú la pillas hasta el primero ya. Vaya, móvil, Que no, que coño, que es así, que pasa que es que de verdad. No, está bien, si cosa que se ha caído porque le da así. Ahí está bien. Vale.
Claudia, and how do we prove that liberty exists? We think that freedom exists because we think. And why? Because no one can restrict our thoughts. And we will prove that with our arguments, and as we have been doing during all the debate. First, he said that in certain cases you are free to make decisions, but when they don't have consequences, you're not responsible. But that you are not aware, it doesn't mean that they will have repercussions on your life.
and we will talk about that on our third argument. In the same way that we will talk about, Rebecca said in the introduction that determinism goes related to responsibility. So determinism says that you never can be free, because it always there is something that te condiciona. So also we will talk that in our third argument, which is circumstances make freedom. First of all, Ortega said, Spanish philosopher and essayist once said, I am myself and my circumstances. With this, we encompass freedom, assuming that it always be conditioned by certain things, but it doesn't make us less free. And in order to do this, we will take our first example as a reference, speaking first of mental issues. Maybe you might think that crazy people is not free because maybe they don't have total responsibility of their acts. But that is because they have assumed certain circumstances that life has imposed to them. First, could be bipolarity, depression, schizophrenia, caused by more previous circumstances, genetic, abuse, violent environment during childhood. So, because of their circumstances are different to what are the circumstances of normal people, we cannot say that they have the same freedoms. So, therefore, they don't have the same responsibilities as a normal person will have. But under the conditions that we have mentioned before, they are free to make their own decisions. Normally limited, just like, but it doesn't stop them to.
But don't you think that, as you said, if our behavior comes from the genetics, that could be a circumstance? We are not determined.
Yeah, exactly. We're saying exactly that we are determined since we were born. There are some circumstances that determine us, but inside those conditions, we keep being free to decide whatever we want and to act like whatever we want. So, we can say that, for example, in the case that crazy people, to say it that way, commit a crime. According to the Article 20 of the Spanish Penal Code, exempt from criminal liability are those who, at the time of committing a crime offense, due to any anomaly or alteration, cannot understand the illegality of the act or act accordance with their understanding. That means that because of their conditions, they have less liberty since they are born, so the society imposes them less responsibilities. So we cannot impose the same punishment to a person who is mentally ill for a person who is healthy. So finally, we can conclude that according to our thesis, under our circumstances, whatever they might be, we can be free as long as we can also be responsible. And that freedom and that responsibility will be different in each case, but they will always exist together. Thank you.
Si la podía hacer una vez bien.
Freedom rather goes hand in hand with the decisions we make consciously, and these may or may not be made freely. ¿Lo has entendido ya, Pablo?
Antes me has dicho bote.
Te he dicho lo mismo, pero
Pues no cambia la palabra.
No, le he dicho exactamente lo mismo.
Ahora ha dicho de cosas.
Ya podéis decir.
No, pero ahora voy a quitar de leer y me habéis liado.
Daré directamente lo que está en negrito.
Uno, dos.
Bueno, espera, déjame tú también la tuya.
Bien dicho. Sí,
Que yo tampoco la he pillado todavía.
Vaya pique hay aquí, Pique de teso.
Vosotros sabéis ahora no voy a tener que editar eso.
Joder.
¿Qué pasa? Porque te vamos a cortar. Cortar. Si pone el tuyo.
Vale,
A mí solo me han puesto aquí de cámara. No de...
De los 0,75.
A que nos une a nosotros que no sabéis pronunciar.
Las cámaras, ¿sabes? La duda de las cámaras.
Parece Mbappé.
Te voy a matar, al final. Te voy a coger y te voy a matar.
Hello, I'm Lucia and I'm the second recruiter of my team, which is against the question. Well, I finished our arguments with our third one, which is called determinism also leads to responsibility. Before continuing with our argumental line, I must make clear a concept that will be of vital importance in our argumental line. Well, this is genetic determinism, also called biological determinism. That is a set of beliefs whose common idea is to defend that the human's behavior depends mainly on the genetics we are inheriting. Although it is true that sometimes the behavior is determined by the nature of the environment in which the individual has been developed, I'm going to show you some examples in which the genetic factor has much moved forward. For example, there are 13 factors determined by our genetics that we can choose. So we have to bear with the consequences of them. Let's take the case of two parents. They both measure 1.60 meters long, and they have a child, and that child will want to measure 2 meters, but he won't be able to. He probably will be 1.60 meters tall, and he will have to bear with the consequences. In this case, there are no really important consequences, but there are important consequences in also cases in which we are genetically determined, which are mental illnesses. Okay, we will continue with the clear evidence to understand all this reasoning. Taken from the yearbook of legal psychology, written by the University of Cordoba, according to university experts, the person who has committed crime must have had freedom of will. However, this is not always the case, as we know that there are persons with mental illnesses or disorders that are determined by their genetics.
But don't you think that persons with mental illnesses have less liberty as they are determined genetically and for that they have less responsibility?
Yes, and that's what I'm going to say. That although they would have less responsibility, they would have some type of responsibility. So, although they are determined, that is the opposite to freedom, they would have responsibility. So, responsibility and freedom don't always go linked. Okay, for example, schizophrenia, which makes a violent behavior that may prevent the individual to act freely. In these cases, the sentence of punish will not be the same, but he will still have to suffer the consequences and be responsible of committing a crime. The thing is that we think that the responsibility is linked to freedom. However, we have shown in our argumental line that it's not always like that. And also that sometimes responsibility is linked with determinism, which is the contrary to freedom. Therefore, it does not make sense that the responsibility goes with something and also with its opposite. So, we reason that indeed responsibility is linked to certain decisions, whether we are we have freedom or not to make them. And now I'm going to talk about what the other thing has said. First of all, I'm going to say that you have said that making decisions, if we make decisions, we are always responsible. But not always is like that. For example, in our second argument, we have explained that although we are free to make a decision, we can be pressured to make it. So in this case, we are not responsible. The responsible ones are the ones that we are pressuring us. And also, I'm going to say that responsible and freedom are together and are two pillars of the society. But it's not always like that, as we have just explained. So, why is freedom linked to responsibility? Why is responsibility linked to freedom? and also determinism if they are opposites. In fact, aren't you saying that responsibility is linked to decisions, whether we are free or not to make them? Thank you.
Bueno, ¿tuviste la revolución? Rodrigo, ¿te gusta que se pongan? Rodrigo.
Me gusta cómo juega.
Que no te gusta si juega.
Ah, ¿qué estás diciendo? ¿Qué me estás diciendo?
Si juega.
El Rodrigo. Aquí. Así que no lo entiendo.
Barraba, lo vi.
Good morning, everyone. First, I want to thank to the teacher, the public, but mainly to the contrary team, because they hadn't let us to positionate radically with the question, do freedom and responsibility go hand by hand? Consequently, there were some common points, such as, at first, the contrary team gave us the reason that the important decision implies responsibility, that the 1% of the decision we made are important, we have consequences, and we are free to make it or not. Another common point was that there are situations in which we are determined. Last, you give us the reason in the fact that a person, for instance, with mental diseases such as schizophrenia, as you have said, are less responsible. But you have give us the reason that they are also less free and have less liberty. You have explained your thesis, that is, we consider that freedom does not go with responsibility, because freedom rather goes hand in hand with the things we made consciously, as it can be free or not. You have defended it with the arguments. The first argument, the decisions we made in one day, in which you have explained that only the 1% of decisions are consciously and that the 99% are unconscious and they don't consider it free. But you have given us the reason that only the 1% are important, and we use our liberty to take it. The first argument, how we take decisions, being influenced. Lucia has defended that we behave depending on your genetics, but this doesn't mean that although we are determined by our genetics, it doesn't mean that the actions we made or we don't make, also we are determined by our genetics. It doesn't mean that we aren't responsible, because, for instance, a person who is crazy and kills someone will go to prison also, or maybe to a psychiatrist, but won't be free. And your last argument was that determinism leads to responsibility, in which you have given us the reason that as less liberty, and less responsibility, less liberty we have. And we have explained our thesis. Being free within your circumstances, you have responsibility for what we think the freedom that they bring you. And we have explained with the first argument, freedom and responsibility are two pillars of society, when freedom and responsibility escape from society, and freedom and circumstances. Thank you very much.
Ma dovete non ce l'aveva tanto che dura solo. Es que ni con el FIFA me pido.
Chicos, vamos a terminar el debate y ahora hablamos.
Porque no cuentas.
¡Vamos, cállate!
Do freedom and responsibility always go hand in hand? To the question asked, my group answers no. Our position is not radical, since it is true that certain times these are late. In that we agree with you. But as has been observed throughout the debate, our position was better than yours, because the case defended by our colleagues in the opposing team is in fact a minority. Hi, I'm Khaled and I'm the concluder of the Ipatia team. Thanks to the jury, the audience, and especially the opposing team for making this debate possible. It is true that our lines cross at all times in aspects such as that responsibility is connected to the decisions we make. Although while you defend that these decisions are made freely, we explain that these are an exception, as our thesis mentions that freedom rather goes hand in hand with the decisions we make consciously, and these may or may not be made freely. You support your position with your thesis, which defends that being free within your circumstances means being responsible with the freedom they give you. And furthermore, in your first argument, you argue that they are the two pillars of society, and that one needs the other. We do not agree with this, so we have refuted that they don't always go together, not even a majority of times, as Paula explains in her argument. Then you have mentioned that freedom and responsibility, and that freedom is taken from you when you are responsible. You are talking about assuming with responsibility and consequences, but these decisions do not mean freedom, because you could have made them being determined, as Lucia explains. Lastly, you argued that I myself and my circumstances, where you talk about genetics and how they condition you. And we agree with you, because when they determine us, we do not have freedom at all, as my partner Lucia mentioned. Just as the opposing team has tried to defend its position through its arguments, we have done it with our free. The decisions we make in a single day, in which we have shown through studies that we make a large number of choices a day, of which we are aware of very few. And between those and even fewer require responsibility, since its consequences are vague. Thus, we reaffirm our thesis. Even though we are free, the responsibility for our decisions falls on others. That's our second argument. We explain that on many occasions, the responsibility for our choices lies largely with external factors, since they are the most influential when we make them. Schopenhauer said, a man can do as he wishes, but he cannot do as he wants. This approach reaffirms the idea that we are not completely free all the time, which is the basis of our last argument. Responsibility is often linked to determinism, and thus is contrary to freedom. So we come to the conclusion that responsibility is not linked to freedom, but to the choices we make, whether our response was determined or not. In conclusion,
Corte ya, señor.